People have already moved on from Greenland. The headlines came and went. The clips circulated for a few days. Social media found something else to argue about. And just like that, one of the most extraordinary moments in modern international politics slipped quietly into the background. But it shouldn't have. Because only weeks ago, something happened that would have been unthinkable for almost 80 years. European forces were quietly repositioned in Greenland, not to deter Russia, not to counter China, but to prepare for the possibility of aggression from the United States. That fact alone should stop us cold. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It wasn't a drill. It was a recognition, however uncomfortable, that the old assumptions about American behavior can no longer be taken for granted. And once that line is crossed in the minds of allies, it does not simply reset itself. History doesn't work that way. Even if policymakers would like to move past it, the rest of the world will not forget. This was a turning point, one that signals the end of a long era in which American power was assumed to be predictable, stabilizing, and fundamentally aligned with the interests of its allies. For decades, the unimaginable remained unimaginable. That safeguard is gone. And here's the first misconception that many are clinging to, treating this moment as if it begins and ends with Donald Trump. It does not. The forces that propelled him into office, that amplified his worldview, that normalized his approach to power, none of that evaporates when he leaves. They are not tied to one man. They are currents, not eddies. They existed before him. They will persist after him. The comforting fantasy is that once Trump exits the stage, America will somehow snap back into a pristine post-war consensus. That beneath the chaos, a stable, unified American public has been patiently waiting to reassert itself. It is a seductive idea, and it is entirely false. Long before Trump appeared, the American electorate was restless. Across the political spectrum, there was a profound sense of disillusionment with the global order the United States had built and maintained since 1945. Democrats felt betrayed by trade deals that seemed to hollow out communities. Republicans felt exploited by alliances that appeared to demand sacrifice without adequate return. Independents and swing voters saw a system designed for others, not for them. Across party lines, a conviction had taken hold. The rules were no longer fair, the promises no longer real, and the institutions no longer reliable. Trump did not create that resentment. He simply articulated it. He gave voice to a sentiment that had been accumulating quietly for decades, a sentiment both obvious and under-acknowledged, that the world order, once taken for granted, no longer protected the interests of everyday Americans. That what was once assumed, American primacy, unquestioned influence, automatic global leadership, was no longer uncontested. And so to treat Trump as an anomaly is to misread the currents of American society. He was not a rupture, he was a symptom. This misunderstanding has real consequences. When observers assume that the country will return to normal after one election or one presidency, they miscalculate both influence and urgency. They underestimate the persistence of structural forces, economic anxiety, regional disparities, cultural dislocations, and a growing skepticism of elites and institutions. They mistake the surface for the foundation. The reality is more enduring and more consequential. The grievances Trump leveraged remain. The political alignments he exploited are still in place. The pressures that drove voters to embrace his worldview have not dissipated. They have only deepened in some regions and sectors. Understanding this is critical. It means recognizing that American politics is not simply a story of individuals, but of systems and sentiments. Policies and personalities matter, but so do the forces shaping perception, trust, and identity. Trump's exit will not erase these forces. It may redirect them, it may mutate them, but it will not dissolve them. Those who fail to see this risk being blindsided by the next expression of the same discontent. They risk assuming that leadership alone can restore stability, when in truth, it is the underlying currents of public opinion and the gaps between governance and expectation that define the trajectory of the nation. Trump's significance lies less in the man himself than in what he revealed about America. He was the messenger, not the origin of the message. And until that message is understood, until the sources of dissatisfaction are addressed, the political landscape will remain unsettled, reactive, and profoundly consequential. To ignore that is to treat an effect as if it were the cause, and history rarely forgives that mistake. He ran on America first and won, not once, but again. That should tell us something profound about the state of American public opinion. This wasn't an accident or an anomaly, it was a verdict. And yet many continue to say, once Trump is gone, everything goes back to normal. That belief does more than misread reality. It absolves people of responsibility. If the problem is temporary, then no one has to act now. No hard decisions need to be made. No uncomfortable investments, reforms, or sacrifices are required. Just wait it out. Ride the storm. Normalcy will return on its own. This mindset isn't optimism, it's appeasement. And it mirrors the approach many European leaders have taken, hoping that patience, politeness, and symbolic gestures would preserve the old order without requiring structural change. But the world has already moved on. We are now in an era defined not by shared rules, but by raw power and by empires willing to test limits. That raises a brutal question for countries caught in between. Can you survive as a sovereign state without real power of your own? Because in a world dominated by predatory powers, being at the table is not a matter of goodwill. It's a matter of leverage. Individually, European countries do not possess that leverage. Acting alone, they are not middle powers. They are small powers, economically significant, culturally influential, but strategically marginal. On their own, they are not players. They are potential terrain. But united, Europe is something else entirely. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable. The idea that Europe cannot defend itself without the United States has become an article of faith in some circles. NATO's leadership often repeats it, warning that European self-defense would require absurd levels of military spending, figures like 10% of GDP. That claim is misleading. Europe does not need to replicate the United States. It does not need global power projection. It does not need to police the world. It needs one thing, the ability to defend itself against Russia. And Russia, after more than a decade of war, has failed to occupy even a quarter of Ukraine. The goal is not dominance, it is deterrence. Europe united can absolutely sit at the table, but that immediately raises another question. Which Europe are we talking about? Because the institutions meant to represent Europe, the EU and NATO, were built for a very different configuration of power. They were designed in a world where American leadership was unquestioned and where rules and power reinforced each other. That configuration no longer exists. And yet there's no guarantee that the institutions built over decades can survive in a world where power has fragmented, where alliances are transactional rather than permanent, and where old hierarchies no longer command respect. What is striking is where real momentum is coming from in Europe today. Not Brussels, not NATO headquarters, not the bureaucracies whose walls are lined with history and protocol. Real action is emerging from ad hoc coalitions, small groups of states willing to act decisively when formal structures lag behind. When urgency demands, they step outside the rules and move. Greenland is the perfect illustration. The response did not originate from the European Union. It did not flow from NATO's command centers. It came from a handful of countries prepared to act because the formal institutions were too slow, too constrained, and too anchored in a bygone era. Procedures that once ensured stability now inhibit rapid response. By acting outside them, these coalitions demonstrated agility, flexibility that the old structures simply cannot match. And that shift is significant. It suggests that the future of power may not reside in formal alliances, treaties, or charters. It may reside in flexible coalitions of the willing, groups that can form, act, and dissolve based on immediate necessity. Influence is no longer about institutional authority alone. It is about capacity, speed, and the willingness to bear risk when others hesitate. Which brings us to Donald Trump and the ways other nations have learned to engage with him. There's a popular narrative that China holds the blueprint. Respond to threats with threats, tariffs with tariffs, a show of power with a show of power, and Trump will retreat. On the surface, it appears effective, and in certain instances, it has worked. But China is a unique actor. It possesses leverage Europe does not: scale, centralized control, a state apparatus capable of absorbing shocks and playing a long game that smaller, decentralized powers cannot sustain. Its economy, its political system, and its strategic patience create cards that no European country can match. Matching Trump's volatility with blunt force works for China because China can endure consequences that Europe could never shoulder without destabilizing itself. The lesson is subtle but critical. The formula of retaliation does not translate across contexts. What worked for Beijing cannot be copied in Brussels, Berlin, or Paris. Europe cannot mirror China because it lacks the same tools and unity of purpose. Its strength must lie elsewhere, in coordination, in diplomacy, in the strategic use of the power it does possess, however fragmented. In Greenland, we saw the potential. Small groups acting decisively, leveraging what influence they have, achieved results that sprawling institutions could not. And that is the real takeaway. Power is no longer about formal authority alone. It is about action, credibility, and the willingness to confront a disruptive actor on one's own terms. Europe's challenge now is profound. Can it translate ad hoc responsiveness into sustainable strategy? Can coalitions of the willing evolve into a durable framework capable of deterring aggression while remaining independent of external dominion? Or will institutional inertia continue to limit effectiveness, leaving Europe perpetually reactive rather than proactive? Trump may be only one actor in this story, but his presence has exposed a broader truth. The age of predictable, institutionally mediated diplomacy is over. The future belongs to those who move fast, act decisively, and wield influence flexibly, because the world no longer waits for committees to deliberate. The Greenland moment was not an anomaly, it was a preview. More revealing examples come from countries far smaller and weaker than the United States. And yet, in the face of pressure, they stood firm. Mexico, Canada, Brazil, India. These nations are not global hegemons. They do not control the world economy. They are deeply intertwined with American trade, investment, and policy. They are vulnerable in ways that Europe often refuses to acknowledge. And yet, over the past year, they demonstrated something remarkable: the ability to set boundaries and enforce them. They drew red lines. They said no. They accepted the risk of retaliation. They understood that pushing back could trigger tariffs, sanctions, or political blowback. They knew there would be consequences, and yet they acted anyway. Certain limits, they made clear, would not be crossed, regardless of pressure, threat, or posturing. And every time they did, the world saw the results unfold in real time. Trump reacted, markets reacted, and when the markets reacted, Trump backed down. The pattern repeated. Each assertion of principled firmness produced measurable outcomes. Each act of restraint, executed calmly, consistently, and visibly, shifted leverage in favor of the smaller actor. The story was not about brute strength. It was about clarity, credibility, and a willingness to risk temporary discomfort for long-term advantage. Europe, by contrast, tried an entirely different approach. Flattery, deference, symbolic gestures, broken protocol, invitations meant to charm, carefully staged smiles for cameras, golf games and personal meetings designed to soothe or distract, 1,000 little acts meant to curry favor, to smooth over tensions, to persuade through personality rather than principle. And none of it worked. The contrast is stark. The smaller nations gained leverage not because they possessed greater resources or superior alliances. They gained leverage because they understood the dynamics of influence and acted decisively. Europe, with its history, its institutions, and its bureaucracies, found itself paralyzed. Actions that should have been taken promptly were delayed. Requests that should have been made clearly were hedged in nuance. The result: influence deferred, opportunity lost, leverage wasted. This is more than a lesson in foreign relations. It is a lesson in strategy, in understanding how power functions in practice. Formal authority, long-established procedures, and grand institutions can impress on paper, but when faced with volatility, clarity, and resolve, often outperform status and ceremony. Trump may have been unpredictable, even volatile, but volatility is not randomness. It is a system responding to incentives. When confronted with certainty, firmness, and defined limits, even the most erratic actor adjusts behavior. Markets respond, policy shifts, outcomes change, and yet those lessons are hard for established powers to internalize. Old habits die slowly. Europe's reliance on charm and ceremony illustrates this vividly. Where smaller nations acted boldly, Europe hedged. Where smaller nations drew lines, Europe extended hands. Where smaller nations provoked a realignment of attention and leverage, Europe provoked nothing at all. The contrast cannot be overstated. The lesson is unmistakable. Influence in the modern world is earned by clarity, risk tolerance, and credibility, not by size, protocol, or tradition. The narrative is simple, but the implications are profound. When the world watches, the bold and decisive will be heard. The hesitant and ceremonial will be ignored. And every time that happens, the rules of engagement are rewritten, silently, visibly, and irrevocably. A year ago, you could argue it was an open question whether that strategy might succeed. A year later, the evidence is in. Firmness achieved more than submission. Those who set boundaries gained leverage. Those who didn't lost it. That is the lesson Greenland may finally have forced Europe to confront. You don't need China's hand to play the game. Even with fewer cards, how you play them matters. And the willingness to accept pain openly and credibly can shift outcomes. But this dynamic raises another question, especially inside the United States. Did Trump's supporters get what they wanted, or did they have no idea where this path leads? Because what increasingly defines Trump is not strategy, it's accumulation of power. Power for its own sake. Power validated by recognition, dominance, and spectacle. There's a dangerous illusion at the center of this worldview that American power is omnipotent, that military threats, economic pressure, and intimidation alone are enough to bend the world into submission. But American power has never rested on raw force alone. It has rested on legitimacy, on alliances that chose to support American leadership, on a global order that, while imperfect, was seen as preferable to the alternatives, on trust. And that trust is now eroding, not only among rivals like Russia and China, who were never invested in the American order, but among long-standing allies. When allies stop legitimizing American power, the United States doesn't become stronger. It becomes isolated. And isolation does not produce dominance. It produces vulnerability. This shift will not be felt immediately. That's what makes it dangerous. But over the medium term, a world in which former allies actively balance against the United States is a world in which American power is weaker, not stronger. And this is something Trump does not appear to understand, which brings us to military force. Is Trump dragging the world closer to great power war? The answer is yes, but with an important caveat. So far, military power is being used only against actors who cannot shoot back. Venezuela, isolated targets, states with limited defensive capacity. Russia and China are not impressed. They are not afraid. They understand the difference between force and restraint. Iran sits somewhere in between, vulnerable but dangerous. What Donald Trump thinks he can accomplish with these provocative actions isn't always clear. In some cases, the outcomes haven't even begun to unfold. But there is a deeper dimension to this strategy, one that many people outside the United States have not fully grasped. Much of what we're seeing is domestic in nature. This isn't just about projecting force beyond America's borders. It's about normalizing the idea of force inside the country itself. It's about conditioning the public to see military and coercive power not only as tools of foreign policy, but as instruments that can be applied within domestic society. At its core, the goal is not merely to project power abroad, it is to wield that power at home, and that is what makes this so unsettling. When you look at recent domestic flashpoints, incidents that have captured national attention, including those in places like Minnesota, you begin to see patterns that feel less like coincidence and more like preparation. What many observers outside the United States assume is temporary turbulence may, in fact, reflect a deeper structural transformation. The notion that Trump will simply depart and America will snap back to a familiar normal is dangerously naive. The United States is in deeper trouble than many realize. Public trust in institutions is eroding. Norms that once served as guardrails are weakening. The line between civilian governance and coercive power is blurring. This erosion didn't happen overnight. It is not a passing storm. It is a systemic shift, and the world must prepare accordingly, not by waiting for stability to return, but by acting now in anticipation of a changing global order. Because history does not pause for comfort. History does not wait for headlines. And the moments that mark real turning points are often quiet, unsettling, and easy to forget until it's too late. Greenland was one such moment. At first glance, it seemed like a geopolitical oddity, an outlier blown up by media and then dismissed. But beneath the surface, it signaled something far more profound about shifting alliances and distrust of traditional institutions. Similarly, domestic incidents that initially register as isolated flashpoints may actually be early indicators of a broader transformation in how power is deployed and justified. This potential shift matters because it alters expectations about how a democracy functions. Democracies rest on a balance, public consent, rule of law, and the clear separation between civilian authority and coercive force. When those lines begin to blur, the political system evolves into something unfamiliar. Across decades, the U.S. developed a set of norms. Law enforcement is domestic, military force is external, and internal disputes are resolved through civil institutions, not show of force. What we're witnessing now, whether intentional or emergent, is a reordering of that dynamic. The idea that foreign force can be modeled inward erodes the psychological firewall that separates external security from internal governance. This is not to say that violence or force has never been part of American history. The United States has long grappled with civil strife and the use of power domestically, but the context now feels different. It is not reactive, it is preemptive. It is not circumscribed by clear legal boundaries. It is amorphous, justified in the name of security, and dynamically reinforced by political narratives that elevate fear over deliberation. This matters not just for Americans, but for the world. When the internal dynamics of the United States shift, the ripple effects are global. The alliances that depended on American stability begin to recalibrate. Other nations adjust their strategies. Power vacuums emerge. Old certainties disappear. So the question is this: what now? Not simply what will happen after Trump, but what will happen if the underlying forces that brought him to prominence remain intact? What happens when institutional trust is weakened, norms are questioned, and the use of force becomes normalized, both abroad and at home? These are not abstract questions. They have material consequences. If history teaches anything, it is that change rarely announces itself with clarity. It often arrives at the margins, quietly, gradually, and then suddenly, fully realized. Moments like Greenland, domestic incidents, or policy shifts that seem isolated only make sense when viewed together as patterns. And when you see the pattern, the moment ceases to be noise. It becomes a signal, a warning, and one that the world ignores at its own risk.